All right, well, welcome back to our study in Romans. Today we are picking up in Romans chapter 13. We're going to be looking just at verses 1 through 7. It is more than enough, just those 7 little verses. You're going to see it's pretty heavy stuff. We talked about Romans 9, 10, and 11 being heavy. It is. And then we got kind of lighter, and now we hit the beginning of Romans 13, very heavy, and then it'll lighten up a little bit as we finish up the book. So prepare yourselves for this. But if you guys want to read along with me, I will read this for you, and then we can hop into the passage. Romans 13, starting verse 1, it says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister for you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs are due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." All right, well, today we're talking about government, and this is a very interesting subject because this gets very controversial very quickly, right? We go through and we start talking about government and people start getting all worked up. I perhaps made a giant mistake down in Brazil that I thought we would do this series on government and the church, and right before the last election down in Brazil, and man, all it did is like walking up to a hornet's nest full of hornets and slapping it, it was just like, let's see what happens. What could possibly go wrong, And man, it divided our church. I thought it would bring us together, and it totally divided, and it was really a horrible thing, very stressful disaster. So when we come in, there are passages like this that talk about it. Some people said, you shouldn't be teaching on politics in the church. I said, all I'm teaching you is what the Bible says. Now, that's part of that is their attitude problem, that they don't want to hear something that goes against their beliefs. But we have to see what the Bible says. The Bible does talk about politics. Not a lot, but enough to where we have to touch on this subject, right? So he starts off here. We'll just jump right in. In verse 1, he hits us with a knockout punch. He says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." So he starts off, he says, let every soul be subject. Every soul. That is every single one of us. Not most, not some, but every single one of us must be subject to the governing authorities. The word subject is the same word we've seen multiple times throughout the Bible. It talks about being submissive. Submissive. It means placing yourself in an orderly fashion under someone else's authority. Okay, so the government is over us in certain ways, right? Now, there's a huge argument, which we'll talk about at the end, about government overreach and that kind of stuff. We'll all talk about that at the very end. But he says that they are over us and that we must submit to their leadership, okay? And then he goes through and he says, "For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." Okay, this word authority or authorities talk about powers that govern. Powers that govern. Now, I did have one guy down in Brazil. He said, no, that's talking about governmental systems. It's not talking about individuals. But then you'll see as we go through the passage and we get down to verse 4, he starts using personal pronouns. He says, "For he is a minister of God." For he, and you're like, oh, he, you mean an individual? Yeah, an individual. So then you go, wow, so that's really heavy. Because what he says here is that there is no authority except from God when he talks about governmental authorities. He's saying God has established governmental authorities for a reason. And he says the authorities that exist are appointed by God. And you look at that and you go, wait, So all of the governments have been appointed by God? That seems strange, right? Well, let's see a few examples here, okay? Well, first of all, start off in Job. Turn to Job chapter 42. Just finished going through the book of Job, and there is this gem at the end of the book, chapter 42, verse 2. It says this. He says, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. Here, Job has surrendered to the authority of God. He says, okay, God, essentially, you are sovereign. You are sovereign. Now, this is appropriate because we've been talking about God's sovereignty as we go through chapters 9, 10, and 11. We were talking about how, man, God is in control. He has all power. He has all authority. And so he does whatever he pleases. And so God goes through in his authority. There's nothing that can stand in his way when he says, this is how it's going to be. When he says, this guy's going to be the leader, that guy's going to be the leader. Okay? And so this is a very heavy thing. Now, we see different examples of this. Turn with me to Daniel. In Daniel chapter 4, we see him talking about King Nebuchadnezzar, right? King Nebuchadnezzar had a very interesting journey with God because he started off thinking that he was almost God, and then he, at the end, ends up coming to meet the God of the Hebrews, the God of the Bible, and submits to God as the ultimate authority, which is really bizarre, really wild to think about. So, Daniel chapter 4, verse 17, it says this, this decision is by the decree of the watchers and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. So, what is he saying here? He's saying God is in charge, God can do whatever he wants, and he will put into power whomever he wants. And so that's pretty heavy. So when we talk about King Nebuchadnezzar here, we saw that King Nebuchadnezzar was placed into power by God. Now, he was a powerful ruler. He was kind of the most powerful of the Babylonian Empire. He kind of was the peak of their empire. And he learned that not only was it him that was in charge, but it was God who was above him. Very, very important that we understand that. Okay, now, we see other examples of this. 1 Samuel chapter 10, see the story of King Saul. 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 24 says this, and Samuel said to all the people, do you see whom the Lord has chosen? That there is no one like him among all the people. So all the people shouted and said, long live the king. This is the story of Saul beginning his reign as the king. Okay? It says very clearly, God appointed Saul. Okay? The people demanded a king, but God was the one who chose him out of all the people of Israel. Okay? We see this again. 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 21. It says, so David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me instead of your father and all his house, to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore, I will play music before the Lord. Now, there's a context there that David was dancing, and Michal, Saul's daughter, who was David's wife, was upset with that. And so she ended up kind of criticizing him, and he said, oh, yeah? You think that I'm doing something wrong? Well, God appointed me to this, okay? God appointed me to be king and to celebrate him before everybody. Okay? So we see God is working. God was working to appoint Nebuchadnezzar. He was working to appoint Saul. He was working to appoint David. And so this goes through. And so now when we think about the passage and it says that all authorities are established from God, there's no authority except from God. Well, that has long-lasting implications. Because then you look at it and you say, well, what about all the bad authorities, right? Now, probably the first person when I say bad authorities, you're thinking of Adolf Hitler, right? Now, I would say that there's plenty of other leaders that have been far worse than Adolf Hitler, although I think Adolf Hitler was from the devil. But when you look at Mao Zedong, that guy was one of the most evil men to ever live on the planet. He killed estimated 70, 80 million people. That's a psychopath. Stalin Stalin killed at least 20 million of his own people. Man, he was crazy. There has been horrible leaders throughout history, okay? We all look at Hitler. He's up there. But there have been people who have been really, really horrible. All of them are a part of this. And you say, wait, so God would put someone in who's evil? Well, ultimately, what is God doing? He's working through history to bring about the end of the world that he has written to us about in the book of Revelation, or in the book of Isaiah, the book of Zechariah, whatever's going on. He's got all these prophecies. How is this going to come to pass? If God just keeps blessing, the church just keeps growing, and they keep having revival after revival, it's never going to come to the point where an antichrist can come in and rule the world. There has to be shifts. There has to be changes. And so God will appoint leaders that will bring about those changes in order to bring about the end where things get very dark. And that's the point when Jesus comes back, okay? I would love it if the United States would just reign forever and ever, and we would have revival after revival after revival, and we would see people coming to know Jesus all over the place. And we would be the superpower of the world. That blesses me, right? That blesses me. The United States, my country, superpower. Awesome, right? But that's not how it works, right? That's not how it works always. What we see is that world powers come in, and they reign for a season. Sometimes those seasons are very long, right? Rome itself, the Western Empire, they reigned for over 400 years. It's pretty awesome. Now, there's debate on whether you want to include the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, is that part of it? That reigned for almost 1,000 years, okay? How did they do that, right? That's long. You have England, they reigned for some 200 years. United States has been around for some 200 and something years. And we haven't reigned the entire time, but we've been pretty powerful since the world wars began, right? So what happens? Kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, right? Leaders come and leaders go. And sometimes you have a good leader, sometimes you have a bad leader. And sometimes God's using that in order to work in the world to bring about the end that he wants, because he's sovereign. And that's the thing we look at this. When we look at Romans, he's saying God is sovereign over governments. Okay? So, what does that mean? He's saying that we must submit to that. Now, that doesn't mean we do something immoral. Remember that Daniel didn't listen to the king when they said, hey, no one's allowed to pray except for to the king. And Daniel said, okay, I'll go up in my room and do it secretly and pray to God, because you only pray to God, right? He was willing to disobey because that broke his relationship with God. We don't obey anything that calls us to break our relationships with God. But in all other things, we can submit. And so later on, we're going to talk about paying taxes. That's one way we submit to the government, right? If you're not paying your taxes, you're not doing what's right, okay? Now, I hope everyone in here is paying taxes, It stinks. I don't want to pay taxes, right? But this is something that we have to do, right? So that's part of our submission. The other thing, it was a big fun thing, right? Let's go, Brandon. You guys know what I'm talking about? This guy Brandon won some big race. I don't know, it was NASCAR. Was it NASCAR? And then there's this chant. They're not saying, let's go, Brandon. They're saying something horrible that I'm not going to repeat here, okay? And so I don't know if the announcer didn't understand or intentionally twisted it. He said, oh, look at that. They're saying, let's go, Brandon. And then that became the chant of conservatives. Like, we hate Joe Biden, so we say, let's go, Brandon, because it really doesn't mean let's go, Brandon. It means something terrible against Joe Biden, okay? That's not being subject to the governing authorities. We don't do that. We don't do that. We don't say, F Joe Biden. We don't do that, okay? We don't do that. That is horrible. That is sin. We do not say that. He is our president, whether you think it's legitimate or not, or whether you like him or not, whether he is competent or not. He is still the president of the United States. And so what do? We submit to that. We submit. Now, in a democracy, in a representative republic like ours, we come in and what do? We have an opportunity to voice our opinions. We have opportunity to vote. We have opportunity for free protest. Are we allowed to do that stuff? Yeah, you could do that stuff. Great. Speak up. You say, I don't like this. This isn't right. This isn't moral. No, we need to protest this decision. Okay, you can do that. But you don't go around disrespecting the governmental authorities, whether it be the president or the governor or a senator or whoever it is, right? Now, are some of them crooks? Absolutely. Some of them are. There are some laws that are in place that they can do insider trading, but anyone else outside of the government does insider trading, they go to jail for a long time. That's not right. okay? We can speak up about that, but that doesn't mean that we can attack the person for that, right? We have to be subject to governing authorities, okay? And that's really complicated because when you're in Germany and they're saying, all right, bring out all the Jews back in World War II, are you going to submit to that? Well, that's killing someone. That goes against our religious beliefs. And that's why there were so many people who were out there who were hiding Jews in their house and saying, no, we're not giving up any Jews. You know, we're going to hide them in our attic. We're going to hide them in our basement, right? We're going to do whatever we can to help save lives because that's part of our role here, okay? So they were defying the government. They're not submitting on that point, right? There were people that came in, man, they saved all sorts of people's lives. I don't know if you know the story of Corrie ten Boom in the Netherlands. Fantastic story. You guys have to read that or watch. There's a movie about it. Absolutely beautiful, amazing story. But in general, we don't have that oppression coming, at least not yet here in the United States. And so we submit and we don't disrespect anybody who's part of the government. We voice our opinions when it needs to be voiced, and we can stand up for what's right, okay? Very, very important. But God is doing something in government, through governments. He has appointed people that we think, well, I don't know if that guy should be president. Yeah, but for some reason, he's in there. God has allowed that to happen in his sovereignty. And so we say, okay, if that's what happened, okay, did Joe Biden really win this election? Was it rigged? I don't know, but God put him there for a reason. He's in there. And so we submit and we say, okay, and we should be praying for our governmental authorities all the time, okay? I confess, I don't pray enough for Joe Biden. That guy needs serious prayer. And honestly, like that guy, he might be in jail if he gets out soon because some of these scandals that are going on, it's like, wow, there's some really serious stuff, right? We need to pray for him. We need to pray for him. So let's be careful with our attitudes towards government. Okay, now continue on. Let's go back and look at verse 2. He says, therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Okay, so this is powerful. We do not resist the authority, right? The word resist means to oppose. So we're not going out there to oppose. We're not trying to overthrow the government, nothing like that. But we are allowed to protest to make our voices heard. So two different things. One of the things that we told our church down in Brazil, there were some protests that went on, some things that were not right down in Brazil. There's still many things that are not right down in Brazil. And I told the church always, hey, you guys, according to your constitution, have the right to protest. Anytime a protest turns into violence or any sort of destruction of public property, now there's laws being broken, and that's no longer cool. That's sin. And so if you guys are down there protesting, if someone starts doing that, you better get out of there so that you're not caught up in that, because now you're resisting the authority. You're opposing the authority by being violent. That's not what we're supposed to do. Letting your voice be heard is one thing. Going and attacking a building or breaking something, that's completely wrong, right? Completely wrong. So we have to make sure that we are following what the Bible says, okay? Not opposing the government, because the government has been instituted as an ordinance of God. Wow, that's heavy, right? Ordinance of God. Again, we'll come back to this point at the end. Okay, continue on, verse 3. He says, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. So, he says, rulers aren't scary if you're doing everything right. And that's true. So, down in Brazil in the 1970s and early 80s, they had military control. It might have even been in the 60s. They had a military government. The military dominated the country. Now, the country was extremely safe at that time. Things were very affordable at that time, which is the exact opposite of Brazil today. Extremely expensive and extremely dangerous, right? The government controlled everything. And they'd catch people out late at night. They could arrest them for being out past a certain hour. That's how much control they had, right? Big government, big control. And so, what do? They're going through and they're looking for people who are doing what's wrong. I talked to my father-in-law back in the day and asked him about it. He said, it was fantastic. Man, the military rule was fantastic. You hear all these people like, it was the worst thing ever. And he was like, it was fantastic because if you did what was right, you had nothing to worry about. We would get up, go to work, we'd come home, the streets were safe, you can catch a bus, no worry about getting robbed, you get up, you go to church, you come back. If you're at home when you're supposed to be home, you're doing the things you're supposed to be doing, you have no concern about the government, okay? But if you're out and you're causing trouble, and you're out drinking excessively, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're making noise on the street, well, you better watch out because a military jeep could come by, arrest you, and maybe no one would ever see you again. Well, that's trouble, right? Okay? But he said, man, it was fantastic. Okay? Why? Because we did everything right. He did everything right, at least for a while, right? So he had no fear, and he says, hey, this is the thing. If you do what's right, you get up, you work, you go and you pay your taxes, and you go to church, and you help people in your community. You have nothing to fear from the government, right? They're here to help us. That's the whole theory, at least. And so he says, hey, you want to be unafraid? Do what's good. And you're going to have praise from the same. Now, things are changing, right? Because now, all of a sudden, we're getting twisted in our thoughts, and our government is now calling things that are evil good, and things that are good evil, right? We've flipped. And I don't know if you guys, I'm sure you guys have noticed this, but it's getting very serious. Hasn't gotten to the point where it's gotten too bad and having big implications on our daily life, but it will. It will, okay? So for right now, we do what's good, we're fine. No one's bothering us here in Oklahoma. No one's busting in our doors here, the church. We're allowed to meet together. We're allowed to fellowship together. We're allowed to live our lives. It's fantastic, okay? So for right now, what do? Do what's good. Do what's good, and you have nothing to fear from the government. Fantastic. Okay, now, here's what he says. Check out Titus chapter 3. In Titus chapter 3, verse 1, he has a very interesting insight. He says, remind them to be subject, the exact same word as Romans chapter 13, to rulers and authorities, to obey, to be ready for every good work. Okay? Be ready for every good work. Well, we've been talking about this anyway. Right? Doing good to others. That's what we're supposed to do as Christians, right? We even talked about that last week, that when someone brings something evil against you, what do? You're supposed to respond in love, which is really hard, but that's what we're supposed to do. So we were talking about how prepare good in your heart before you leave the house so that when someone comes at you with something bad, you're ready to bless them with something good, right? Well, that's exactly what Titus is saying, but he's giving it in a different context. He's saying, in terms of the government, subject yourselves to all the rulers, all the authorities, and then he says, and be ready for every good work, okay? So, even when the authorities come around, you do good things. You bless them, right? You can bless the authorities, but you can also just be actively involved in doing good, right? We have an opportunity to serve coming up in the food kitchen. What a great opportunity for all of us to do good, right? Let's do some good, and let's go on out there and do that. So when we're busy doing good, who's going to come and attack us? Like, what are you doing feeding those poor homeless people? No one's going to come and say that to us. If we're doing what's good, they're going to be like, hey, all right, I like that. Good job. Keep it up, right? So the government is looking for people who are causing problems. If we're doing what's good, we're free. We have nothing to worry about, right? All right, back to the passage, verse 4. This is where it starts to get personal. He says, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. So man, we got all sorts of things going on in here. So as we go through, we see this. We're saying that this governmental authority can be an individual. He is God's minister to you for good. Okay? This is his role. He has been appointed. Now, can a minister who's supposed to do good do bad? Yeah, they can. They can. That's why the United States was actually invented. We saw time and time again kings that got into power that abused their power. And they began to force different laws and different regulations onto people. It definitely affected the church. So we started as a nation. Why? Because the Pilgrims came across the Atlantic, right? And who were the Pilgrims? They were Puritans. Puritans that had escaped England because of persecution against them by the king and the governmental authorities. And so what they do, they fled to the Netherlands. Then they went to the Netherlands and they said, this is not our country. This is kind of uncomfortable. Maybe we can find a new place to start a new land and try to live the life that we think that we should live. And they came across and they landed at Plymouth in Massachusetts, right? Okay, this is the foundation of our nation. People trying to do what's right. So, there was evil that was going on in England. Not all ministers are good. Even though they're called to be good, they don't all do what's right. So he says, hey, you do what's right, okay? You have nothing to be afraid of. You do what's evil, oh, you better watch out. You better watch out because they're going to come and get you, right? So I've heard all these stories. People, I was watching this podcast about prison life, and you had the story of these guys who were dealing drugs, and they know, oh, people are following us, but they have no idea the actual government, the FBI, is following them for months. They have all of their phones tapped. They're on their cell phone. They're getting down every single word that these guys say on the cell phone, every deal. They're marking it down, and they're just building this giant case against this guy. And then when they come in and say, here's all the evidence we've got against you, and the guy's like, wow, I thought you were just following me the last couple of days. No, we've been following you for 8 months, gathering information, okay? You're done. Why? The guy's trying to be a drug dealer. He's doing evil. If you want to be a drug dealer, they're going to get you eventually. There's no way. I've only heard one story of a drug dealer who did it for a little bit and then quit and got away with it. He's the only one I've ever heard of. All these guys, they get so greedy, they want more money, and then what happens? Eventually the government catches. If you do evil, be afraid. They're going to come after you. Now, I hope that I'm not preaching to anyone in here, because I don't think any of you guys are doing evil, right? But it is a warning. Watch out. Watch out, because if you start doing evil, you say, well, I can do a little bit of evil. No, don't do it, because the government is going to come against you. And he says, does he not bear the sword in vain? You go, what? He has a sword? Yeah, the government. They have a sword, okay? And it's powerful. What they used swords for back in the day was for killing people. So you did something against the government, what they do? Might chop off your head. They're going to take your life. It was very serious, right? So he's talking about he's God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath. What's he saying? They have the power of the death sentence. Okay, now, we have a big debate here whether we should have that in the United States, right? And I know most of the states don't have it anymore. But the Bible says they have that authority for hundreds and hundreds of years because God said, hey, when these guys do evil, you take them out of society so that society can continue as a whole. We have a completely different philosophy now, right? Let them out. Let them go free. I don't know if you guys saw recently, there was a robbery. I think it was somewhere $300,000 stolen from a mall in Los Angeles. These guys went in, this whole group of guys, full of sweatshirts and masks and sunglasses, and they ran into this mall. I don't know how many there was. It was like something like 30 people. They ran in and just started grabbing everything they could, started breaking stuff, started grabbing everything, and then all ran out, right? And what did the people do? Nothing. Why? Because in Los Angeles, if you steal up to a certain amount, they don't prosecute you. They let you go. And so these guys come in and steal, and they've all been taught, hey, don't do anything if someone comes and steals, because if you do something and attack that person who's stealing, you're going to get in trouble for attacking the thief. Man, like I said, our government is so twisted that we're calling good evil and evil good, okay? But back in the day, when people did that, what would happen? They'd execute wrath on those type of people that were practicing evil, okay? Now, again, we're going down the wrong path here in the United States of America, but this is very important that we understand. If you never do that, you never have to worry about the police coming after you, right? Be in the right place at the right time, doing the right things. You never have to worry about the police coming after you, okay? Now, I don't know if you guys have ever been in trouble with the police. I got in trouble with the police a few times, right? I got in trouble. One time, I'm trying to think of which story I should tell you guys. One time we were skateboarding. I got in trouble several times with the police. I was skateboarding with my friends, and we thought, oh, this will be fun. We'll go up on a parking structure, and we'll skate down it because it's really smooth, and it was late at night, and so there was no one around, you know? And so we're skateboarding down. Well, man, this cop comes flying up at us. I don't know how he even knew that we were in there. He comes flying up, and my friends all jump off their boards and run away, and then I was the last one in line. And so he pulls up, hops out of his car, puts his hand on his gun and says, get on the ground. And I was like, and I jumped down and got on the ground, you know. And so I didn't get arrested that time, but I did get a nice fat ticket from him for skateboarding in a public place. You're not allowed to do that. And I said, well, I thought the law was I can use this for transportation. I was going from point A to point B. He didn't like that. So I got busted, right? If you're skateboarding in a place where you're not supposed to be skateboarding, what happens? Execute wrath. Now, it wasn't wrath like losing my head, but it was wrath of like a $150 ticket, right, for skateboarding, right? So I learned. So then another time, I was on my campus in college, and I was skateboarding again. And I had a longboard, so I was kind of cruising. And there's this nice road that goes right into campus at the entrance of our campus. And so I don't even know where I was before, but I was skating in on campus, right? And I'm kind of skating, I'm moving down, feeling so good, beautiful day, right? And I felt that there was something behind me. And so I kind of glanced back and, oh, wow, it's a cop right behind me. I'm like, oh, I'm in trouble. So then I knew from my previous problem, if I get caught here, I'm going to get a fat ticket. I can't do that. There's no skateboarding on my campus. None. And so then forgive me, I did this. I waited. I kept skating like I didn't see him. And I went up, and there was a dorm right here on the side. There were stairs that ran up there. And as soon as I got close, I said, 1, 2, 3, go. And I jumped off. I grabbed my skateboard, and I ran as fast as I could into the dorm. He pulled up. He tried to chase after me. I ran in the hallway and ran up the stairwell and hid. He never found me. And I got away with it. But it's like, man, if you're doing what's right, that doesn't happen, right? And I had to learn, hey, you're not allowed to skateboard on campus. Cut it out. So I eventually stopped. So this is something that's very interesting. Little thing can cause a lot of problems, right? So what do? We do good. If we do good, we don't face wrath from the government. Not from the police, not from the problem, like nothing, right? Now, I'm going to skip that. Let's keep going. I can go deeper in this and I'll just get myself in trouble. So, he says that he is an avenger of God's wrath. I want you guys to look with me in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. It says this. Therefore, submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king supreme, it goes on, or to governors, or to those sent by him. Oh, I got 14 as well. Governors, or as those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. Okay, so it says the same thing. Hey, do good. Follow every ordinance of man. What is he saying? Follow the laws. Follow the laws, right? If you're driving 60 and you're in a 30 zone, you're not following the laws. It's like, well, that's just man's laws. It's like, no. Actually, the Bible tells us we're supposed to follow man's laws and not be provoking any of the governmental authorities to wrath, right? So, you drive the speed limit, you stop at stop signs, you never have a problem, right? You never have a problem. So, be careful how you drive. Not only how you drive, be careful what you're doing, be careful where you are, be careful the decisions that you're making because that could bring wrath upon you. All right, back to the passage, verse 5. He says, therefore, you must be subject not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. He says, you want to avoid the wrath of the government. So, because of wrath, you submit yourselves to the government. But he says, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. You want to make sure that you have a clear conscience. I'll tell you what, my conscience was not clear when I was running down the hallways of that dorm with a skateboard in my hand, thinking, oh my gosh, if I get caught, I'm going to get another ticket, I'm going to be in trouble. I had no clear conscience at that point, right? I got away with it, right? I was young, stupid, got away with it, okay? But you do not have a clear conscience after that. I'm not doing what's right. I knew it. Deep down inside, I was like, I'm wrong. I knew it, okay? He says, in order to keep your conscience clean, do what's right. That's it. Do what's right, okay? Now, Paul mentions this in the book of Acts, and I think it's pretty cool because he talks about how he was always striving to have a clear conscience before God. Look at Acts 24, verse 16. It says this, this being so, I myself always strive to have a conscience without offense towards God and men, okay? Towards God and men. It's one thing to have a clear conscience before God, right? But towards men as well, and that's really difficult, right? So he's saying, obey the laws, and then you have a clear conscience towards men, right? Treat people right, and then you have a clear conscience towards men. So he's saying, ultimately, do good. If you live a life of good, who's going to be out to destroy you? Now, there might be someone, but in general, most people are going to like you if you're constantly doing good, okay? Okay, back to the passage, verse 6. He says, for because of this, you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. So he says, because they are God's ministers, right? Minister, I'm a minister, right? I'm the lead minister here at Parkview. What does that mean? It means a servant. That's it. It's a servant. So he says, they're God's ministers too. And he has appointed them. So he says, because of that, we pay taxes in order that they get their salaries paid. That's part of the reason that we do that. Okay? Really interesting. We want to make sure that we pay taxes. Now, there's a lot going on when we talk about taxes. Turn with me to Matthew 22. In Matthew 22, we see Jesus talking about taxes, right? You guys are probably familiar with this, but it's still good to recap. Starting in verse 15, he says this, then the Pharisees went and plotted how they might entangle him in his talk, and they sent to him their disciples with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God in truth, nor do you care about anyone, for you do not regard the person of men. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Wow. So they're trying to catch him in a trap. And so they're like, let's bring up taxes because we can catch him in something that he says there. You know, this is kind of like, some of those reporters, they're always trying to catch somebody, some of the opposite political party and trying to get them. They're going to ask some question that's really difficult that no matter how they answer it, they're going to look bad. That's what they're trying to do with Jesus, okay? Continue on. Look at verse 18. He says, but Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why do you test me, you hypocrites? Interesting. Show me the tax money. So they brought him a denarius. And he said to them, whose image and inscription is this? They said to him, Caesar's. And he said to them, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. Wow. So Jesus had a great answer. Okay? He outsmarted them. And ultimately, what did he say? Pay your taxes. Pay your taxes, right? There was a guy who's somewhat famous, Dr. Kent Hovind, and he was a Christian apologist. He would go around and he would speak on creation, and he would debate atheists and all this stuff. And he kept talking about how, no, you don't have to pay taxes. It's illegal for us to have to pay taxes, right? Because back in the day, there was no IRS, and there was no federal income tax, right? That started at a certain point. It was supposed to be limited, and then, of course, once the government starts something, they never take it away. And so he was arguing this thing, and so he's like, I haven't paid my taxes for years. Well, guess what happened? The IRS came after him, and he went to jail. And I don't know if he even got out yet. Last time I heard, this was several years ago, he was still in jail. And so I was like, bro, just pay your taxes, man. Just pay your taxes and you don't go to jail. It's so much easier. They are appointed by God to serve the people, right? Now, whether they do a good job or not, that's another debate, but that's what they're called to do. And so what did Paul tell us in Romans? He said, pay your taxes. Pay it. Don't worry about it. They are attending continually to this very thing, right? They are busy about this business. So, because they are busy about taking care of things, our responsibility is to pay them their salary, right? Okay, we'll talk about this in just a sec too. Okay, last verse, verse 7. He says, render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor, right? So we want to go through and we want to give whatever people need, right? You need to pay some customs. When you fly into a new country, you got to pay that, right? You owe fear to somebody, just showing respect to somebody, honor to somebody. Do that, right? Don't be disrespectful. You don't need to do that. You don't need to mouth off. That's usually what happens is people start mouthing off to cops, and then they end up getting in more trouble because they're mouthing off. You don't need to do that. That's not what a Christian should do. You shouldn't be mouthing off, right? So we want to make sure that we're covering all of our bases, doing what's right in order that we can live our lives and be busy about the work of the kingdom. Let the government deal with all the problems of society, and we go out and do the kingdom work to reach people for Jesus, to minister to them, to meet their urgent needs. That's what we're called to do, right? Now, before we end, I want to talk a little bit about government. If you go to that next slide. So this little thing that I created to try to explain government. This is sort of the theory of government, right? Now, some of you guys, you're like, yeah, this makes sense. Some of you guys are like, wow, I've never heard anything like this. This is revolutionary. Now, here in the United States, we all study political science. In high school, it's a required class. At least I think it is here. Is it in the state of Oklahoma, political science? Yes? Okay. And in California, we're all required to take it, and then go off to college, and we have to take political science as well if you went to college. In Brazil, never. They never study anything about government, right? They get taught now leftist ideology by the teachers and by the schools, but they don't talk about ideas of government. They don't look at it and study it and compare it. Here's the idea. If you have a small government, you have the government up on top represented by that cloud, you have the people down below. The people pay taxes to the government, right? That's the little money on the side. So when you see that, what are they doing? They're paying the salaries of the government. And the government, in turn, is supposed to provide certain services. That's what those hands with the person is supposed to be like, a picture of someone caring for someone else, right? So the idea is you have a small government, they take care of certain needs, right? So back in the day when you had a government, what happened? You had, way back in the day, they had city-states. So you have a city like Rome, and that was a city-state because it's like that became its own kingdom, right? Rome. Now, Rome expanded and took over all sorts of lands, so that's not the best example, but there were all these little cities, and the cities needed protection because there was all sorts of war going on. So you might have Genghis Khan coming in to try to sack Rome, and he's coming in to take over everything and kill all the men and take all the women and children to be his slaves. And so what do you need? Well, we need protection. And so what do? They hire or they appoint someone to be their ruler. And they say, hey, this is going to be our king, right? And Rome obviously became an empire, and so they had an emperor. But this was something that was very simple. You are our king. You watch over us. You protect us. You go and negotiate with the enemy armies when they come in. This is basic ideas of what the government is supposed to be, providing protection for the citizens that are paying their salaries, right? Now, that money is going to change depending upon the tax rate, obviously, and the size of the government. But in a small government that's just providing the basic necessities, you will pay smaller taxes because they don't need much. So you might have a king or a president or whatever it is, and you pay money up to them so that they can live their lavish lifestyle, but they better protect you. Because if they don't protect their citizens, they lose the money that the citizens are paying to them, right? And so they say, okay, we will protect you from the hoarding bands of invaders that are going to come our way. And we're not going to let them steal our crops and invade our villages because that's going to cause problems for our food supply, which I need you guys as my citizens to be healthy in order to work, to make money, to pay your taxes so I can continue to live my lavish lifestyle as king, right? So it's dependent. There's a dependence that is there, that in order to have the money that you need as the government, you must take care of the basic needs of your people, right? So what happens? Well, the government will then provide certain necessities for the people, and it creates this symbiotic relationship where everyone is happy. The government, people are receiving what they need, the government is getting their money, and everyone is good, okay? Now, go to the next slide. Now we get a big government, right? A big government. Well, the big government, they're going to need a lot more money. And so you have the people. It doesn't matter if there's more people or less people. The bigger the government, the more people you have to feed. The more mouths that are hungry to receive food. So you're going to end up paying a lot more money. This is why I'm a big proponent of small government. Our government has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger through the years. I want to cut it down. I want to make it like a quarter of what it is, man. We need small government. Small government, right? So small government ends up giving the people more freedom. That's what I didn't mention. That was in the middle. Big government, they end up providing a lot more services, but they also need a lot more money. And so you look at some of the socialistic countries that are over in Europe, for example, they have 50, 55, 60% income tax. Man, that's crazy. We had a friend that was down in Curitiba who was a missionary down there with YWAM, and he was from the Netherlands. And he said, man, we pay 60, sometimes a little bit more than 60% of our income. I was like, wow, are you kidding? He's like, but they do everything for us. So he's like, if I wake up and I'm going out to work and I see there's a hole in my street, I call them up. By the end of the day, that hole is filled with asphalt. I said, wow, that's pretty good. Yeah. Because they have a huge government, right? So they pay a lot, they have a lot less, they are definitely under the control of the government, they are dependent upon them, because they will provide all of these services and all of these needs. And then what happens is you end up getting certain people that are completely dependent upon the government. So you might have someone who's on welfare, for example, and then they're going to receive all of their salary from the government, and then who's paying that? Well, that's the people who are working. Okay? This is why socialism ultimately fails every single time it's been implemented. It's ultimately failed. Why? Because the economics of it don't work. Because you have a small group of people who are providing a large amount of money up to a giant government, and you have other people who are just suckling off of the breasts of the government. That's not the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be everyone contributing and everyone paying up and the government providing certain services. And so this is what's going on in our world. This is a battle. So you have the socialistic countries that are kind of spreading and taking over. We have socialism growing in our country. And what are they saying? We want a bigger government. We want the government to have ultimate control. We want them to tell us what's going on. Well, that's what's going on, right? They came out and they said, no, you can't leave your house. It's COVID. Why can't I leave my house? No, because we need you to stay alive in order to pay your taxes so that we can provide all the services for all these people. So you can't leave. I was like, well, that's not part of the government, is it? To tell me when I can leave my house and when I can't? No, it's not supposed to be, but that's the point that we got to, that we surrendered all of our freedom over to the big government, and they started to control everything. And then they started to go in, and apparently they were writing to social media companies and saying, hey, don't let anyone post. If anyone posts about this against us, block their account. And they started blocking all these accounts that said anything against them. So the big government has ultimate control over everything. And that's scary because then when they say, oh, by the way, you're not allowed to go to church anymore. You can't go to church. And then you had pastors up in Canada getting arrested for trying to keep holding church services. That's wild, right? What are they doing? They're just trying to encourage their people who are going through a really difficult time. But the big government controls everything. It's very, very dangerous, right? So when they start coming in, they start saying, no, you can do this, but you can't do this. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom said, all right, now you guys can go back to church, but no singing. No singing, because that could spread COVID to everybody. And it's like, what? Who are you to speak to us about ecclesiastical matters? You're a governor, okay? Isn't there a separation of church and state? Isn't that what you guys claim all the time? Yes, it is. So why do you all of a sudden think that, like, no, the church doesn't tell the government what to do, but now the government's going to tell the church what to do? Okay, so it's doesn't go both ways, right? So this is the trouble. Bigger government, more control, less freedom for the individual, right? So we have to keep this in mind. This is what government's about, right? They are dependent upon us to pay our taxes, right? Now they start raising taxes and they start getting more money and they start doing more things. They start to gain more control. And so we have to speak up. We have to let our votes be heard that we're not going to stand for this, not in our state, right? So this is very, very important that we keep this in mind. Now, what do we do when they start infringing upon our religious freedoms? That's when we start to not listen to the government, right? So that's where we have to be very, very careful. We are facing penalties. I saw a guy on the news, a pastor getting arrested before his family. Why? Because he was sneaking out to have services when they said in Canada, you're not allowed to leave your house. And he said, no, I need to go out, I need to record these videos, I need to send them out to my church. And they said no. And they were following him with a helicopter, and then they arrested him in front of his kids. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. That guy went to jail. Why? Because you don't disobey the government. Okay, so that's where we're going in the United States. That's the direction. We're just right behind Canada, right? So we need to be prepared for that. This is very scary. While we don't have that, while we're still here, we do good. We do good and we try to obey the government at all costs, right? But eventually it's going to turn and there's going to be persecution in the United States. And so we have to mentally prepare ourselves for that. All right. Heavy stuff, right? Let's pray. And if you guys have any questions, we can talk about it afterwards. Father, we thank you so much for this wild passage, so heavy, such huge, long implications that can impact our lives. And I pray, Lord, that you would help us to understand this and process this and kind of figure out where we stand on all this stuff. So we ask, Lord, that you would come and you would bless everybody here, help us to ultimately serve you, not our government, and help us to do our best job now to submit to the government like you called us to do. So please guide us and bless our time. In Jesus' name, amen.